Good evening, everyone. We'll be getting started in 5 minutes. We'll be getting started in 2 minutes. Good evening and welcome to this month's meeting of the Masonic Seminar Series. My name is Brother Katie Kumsi and I am the presenter and moderator of this group. I have here in the studio with me Brother Patrick Alessandra and Brother Benjamin Hartle, who will assist us throughout this evening. I want to welcome those who are domestic in North America as well as those coming internationally, especially those from the Philippines, who this is your study center. I want to welcome everyone that is also joining us for the first time, as well as those who come very devoutly every month to be with us. So I want to give a little bit of a background about the Masonic Seminar Series, as I always do for our new patrons, and then we'll get right into our presentation this evening. The Masonic Seminar Series was created by Universal Co-Masonry to assist in spreading knowledge to those who are interested in Freemasonry, who felt called but didn't really know a lot about it. And so there's some trepidation with the unknown. And so the Masonic Seminar Series was there, created back in 2018 to help bridge that gap without giving away the secrets of Masonic ritual, and by that ruining the experience of each initiate. So Masonic Seminar Series is one of two groups that is offered by Universal Co-Masonry, which is Freemasonry for men and women. The second one is the Masonic Philosophical Society, which has been around much longer than us here at the Masonic Seminar Series. We have online centers as well as in-person centers, domestic here in the United States, if you're interested. The Masonic Seminar is a lecture-based group, so you will hear me speak for the next hour and a half, lucky you, where our Masonic Philosophical Society is going to be more of a discussion-based. That being said, I do stop periodically throughout tonight's presentation to field any questions and hear some thoughts on the topic at hand. I may do that once or twice, but not quite a bit. So sit back. I hope you have tea with you or coffee and something to write your thoughts and your notes down so that you can be present with us throughout the next hour and a half. The purpose of Brother Patrick and Brother Benjamin is to help us on those platforms that we are streaming, such as X, YouTube, Facebook, and obviously Zoom. So if you are coming in from another platform besides Zoom, Brother Patrick will help answer any questions or ask your questions as you're streaming on that platform. And for those who are on Zoom, you can use that virtual hand option if you want to ask questions or be a part of the discussion. The only caveat, no matter what platform you're coming from, is to please be on topic. As many people are here specifically for today's discussion, we don't want to get off track, as that can be very frustrating. So if I cut you off, please do not be offended if that is the case, because I'm trying to stay on topic for us this evening. So tonight, we're going to just jump right into it. We're talking about Freemasonry and the Hermetic Renaissance, or the revival of Hermeticism in the Renaissance era. There's lots of different ways of phrasing it. I haven't quite decided which one I like, so you'll hear me kind of rephrase it as we move. Hermetic tradition, the Renaissance Hermetic tradition tends to be the more popular, academically accepted name, but it doesn't fully encompass all of what it actually is revivaling. So you'll see me kind of struggle with whatever name I kind of flip. So forgive me if that happens. When we are looking at the Masonic Seminar Series, we want to look always at how it's connected to Freemasonry. So let me just give you an outline of where we're going and how, and I will interject, in this case, I'll have Freemasonry throughout, but you'll see a lot of Freemasonry towards the end, because this is a little bit of a history discussion more than anything, as we see the movement from the Western esoteric tradition, which I'll talk more about in a second, into the Renaissance, and then into the proto-Masonry, or Masonry from like 1717, 1723, with the Grand Lodge of England, eventually to become the United Grand Lodge of England. So we're going to talk first about a little bit of history of the recovery. Why is it called rebirth or Renaissance? Or if you're from England, the Renaissance, I believe is how they say it. We're going to talk about the recovery of information, what brings us into the Renaissance. We're going to talk about a very important figure, Ficino. We'll also talk about Pico as well. There is a wonderful podcast by our Legends of the Craft, which is done by Brother Matthias and Brother Axel, that goes for 3 hours. It's awesome, and it's on Pico. I highly recommend it. It is not something that we will go into great detail here, because as much as you love being with me, I think 3 hours is a little bit much, and you can have a more intimate experience with that discussion. But we will talk about Ficino and his contributions just in a cursory way as we move towards understanding how Masonry came to be in our modern era. As always, the Gutenberg press always tends to be a very important, pivotal part of our history, especially because everyone here is impacted by the written word. So we'll talk about how the Gutenberg press assisted in the formation of modern day Freemasonry as well as the Rosicrucians. You can't get by the Renaissance without talking about humanism, as we also see with Pico and Ficino. Humanism is really, really important, though I ask you to keep an open mind because when we think of humanism today, we have a very kind of concrete understanding. But when we look at humanism as it started to come out into the Renaissance period and fully developed at the end of the Renaissance era, it's different enough to make a distinction. It's not going to be the same kind of secularistic, atheistic humanism that we see today. Then we're going to talk about science and mysticism and their fusion and how they come together with a little bit of discussion of the Kabbalah. I'm not going to go into great detail, but just how this all kind of moves together. And then last but not least, the birth of secret societies. There is a lot of history that is really packed into tonight. I am not going to be super hard and fast on dates, and I'm not going to go plunging deep into history because any one of these topics could have its own and does have its own books and lectures and all sorts of stuff. So if you find a particular topic that is mentioned tonight that is worthy of your further attention, by all means, I hope you fall down that rabbit hole in the future days and weeks to come to see how it expands your knowledge on Freemasonry. So before we get into the recovery and the sacking of Constantinople in 1453, I want to give a little bit of back history and kind of lay the landscape out to why that was such an important pivotal moment for the Italian Renaissance. And I am making the distinction of Renaissance and the Italian Renaissance because the Renaissance was born in Italy, as we will see tonight. But when we just say the Renaissance, we're talking about just European in general. But the Italian Renaissance was very specific because that was the epicenter. And that is where we're going to see a great impact against that really political geo landscape that in religious landscape, religio landscape that was prominent at the time. If you haven't watched the last 7 months, which is completely fine, and you're totally okay with today, you're not going to get lost in the sauce. We covered the Western esoteric traditions, the various different traditions and the Western mystical sciences. And I'll go over that just really briefly because that is a part of the Renaissance, because that is what is being brought back to our landscape here in Freemasonry. It is very important in our heritage. So each month, and you can look it up on our YouTube channel, you can go find these, each tradition, each science has its own dedicated lecture, so you can go watch them and kind of get more information if you haven't had a chance to see them or be a part of our seminar in the past 7 months. But the Western esoteric tradition is really, really important because that tends to be the bedrock of what modern Masonry starts to grow out of. There's definitely a lot of infusion in Freemasonry. The word is syncretic, and I'll ask the brothers here to throw that into chats and stuff like that for those who are not familiar with the word syncretic. Syncretic is synthesis, but it's more than that. Like Freemasonry, you can sit in lodge, you can look at the rituals, you can study the rituals, and you can see a large influence of different traditions and mystical sciences. But you can't sit there and say, well, that vein is Hermetic and that vein is Neoplatonic and that, it's not so cut and dry. There's a life to it because Masonry is the heir to the greater mysteries and the ancient mysteries. And so syncretic is going to be the synthesis of all these different influences into a unique and special philosophy, which we call the Masonic philosophy. And you can look at I have a recording, I think, of a session done a couple of years ago on the different enactments of Masonic philosophy, like what is the difference between continental Masonry versus English Masonry, what is the difference between mixed gender versus, single gendered Masonry, that type of stuff. But it's all the same philosophy. It's just how are you going to have a relationship with it? Is it going to be something that is philanthropic, doing charity? Is it going to be something that is civil reform, looking at how to better improve the society that you live in? Or is it going to be a spiritual, intellectual, and when I say intellectual, I mean spiritually intellectual interaction. And at Universal Co-Masonry, we are the last of those three. We look at and interact with the Masonic philosophy from a very spiritual and mental, and again, when I say mental, I'm talking more of the Hermetic definition of mental interaction with that philosophy. So the Western esoteric tradition is extremely important. When we look at Alexander the Great, and what a fantastic name to have, because he truly was great. He did many great things before he died at a young age. He was also very ferocious. He was quite the warrior and did a lot of conquering. But when he died in 323 BC, his kingdom spread all sorts of Greek literature, anything that was Greek speaking, the Hellenistic kingdoms, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, they all had that Greek influence, Hellenistic, that Greek Egyptian influence that spread all of the Greek philosophies into the known world at that time. So you're looking at the writings of Plato and Aristotle and Pythagoras, really a great many philosophers. So that spread and moved out for many, many years. But in the 2nd century BC, you're going to see that those areas were conquered by Rome. And Rome, as all Romans like to do in their time, absorbed that culture. And so you started to see that there was a movement from Greek to Latin, and that the Greek, it's not that the works were lost, it was just going to be seen through the perspective and lens of a Roman, which is different than a Greek. So you're starting to see the changing of those particular philosophies into something very, very different. And then you're going to see that those philosophies, they move, so there's a language difference and then an interpretation difference, then it's going to be Christianized. So you're seeing people like Aquinas, and you're looking at individuals like him, excuse me, not Aquinas, the name just slipped my head. Just left, whatever. So you're going to see that these are going to be Christianized into something different. They're going to be trying to reconcile not so much Christianity with Grecian ancient philosophy, but the other way around, including and incorporating Plato and whatnot into Christianity. And then you'll see in 383 that Theodosius I will start to declare that any pagan religion outside of Christianity is prohibited, and at some point it became by death. So you're going to see the submerging of the greater mysteries into either complete obsolescence or underground. But you still have those manuscripts and texts running around, but again, they're in Latin and it's going to be more Christianized. And then in 529, Emperor Justinian is going to close all the academies that were Greek. So you're looking at the academies like Plato's Academy and whatnot and being shut down, so there was no access. Eventually, those manuscripts start to become less known. They're not readily available. However, you're going to see the Byzantine Empire during the Golden Age of Islam, which I know I'm biased because I absolutely love the Golden Age of Islam. I think it's the most fascinating parts of history, especially in this timeline that we're discussing. But the Golden Age of Islam, which had its height around 1000 AD, is going to keep all these manuscripts. And it's very important that it's the Byzantine Empire, because we'll see with the sacking of Constantinople why that's important. So these texts are going to turn into from Greek to Latin and then to Arabic, but they're going to be safeguarded in the Golden Age of Islam in the Byzantine Empire. So that Western esoteric tradition, so that the Hermeticism, Pythagorean philosophy, Platonism, those are your Gnosticism, those are going to be safeguarded. And Gnosticism, not as much, but the other three for sure are going to be safeguarded in the Byzantine Empire. So that moves us into the rediscovery. So that's kind of the backdrop of which this is all laying upon. Now, what we'll see is that the Byzantine Empire, especially during that Golden Age of Islam, is going to be kind of the bridge of transmission, is what it's called. So the bridge of transmission, meaning that from Greek to Latin, Christian Latin, and then to how do we get it to Italy and have the Italian Renaissance, is going to be through the Byzantine Empire. So in 1453, you're going to see that the Byzantine Empire, which is the last remnants of the Empire of Rome, is sacked and is lost with the bringing down of Constantinople. Constantinople today is known as Istanbul. If you've never been there, it's absolutely lovely and beautiful. I highly recommend it. So the Ottoman Turks come in and they take down Constantinople in 1453. And you're going to see a lot of Greek scholars, like I said, were a part of the Byzantine Empire. And because of this intrusion from the Ottoman Turks, they're going to move away and get out of what is modern day Turkey, leave those places and go to places like Florence and Rome and whatnot. And with them, they're going to bring those manuscripts of Plato. And as you see, Pythagoras, Plotinus, and Hermes Trismegistus, which for those who aren't familiar, Hermes Trismegistus is going to be the bedrock of Hermeticism. And obviously with Plato comes Plotinus, because Plotinus doesn't exist without Plato in their philosophies. One is Platonism, and Plotinus is going to be your Neoplatonism. And then the Pythagorean schools of sacred geometry and number and whatnot is going to come. So all this is going to come out of this political uh, interaction between the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Turks. So with that, you see in 1453, the end of the Byzantine Empire and the beginning of the rebirth of these great documents, these manuscripts, these different philosophies. And the Ottoman Empire will exist until 1922 with the end of World War I, with their defeat in World War I. So you have from the Byzantine Empire, you're going to go straight into the Ottoman Turks, which gives you a whole nother history lesson on something else another day. So let's talk about what these manuscripts brought, and kind of the backdrop of what Italy was like at the time when these Greek scholars came over. So, and I'm going to stop here after this, and this is a pretty big slide, even though there's not a lot of information for you to look at, but there's a lot of information packed into the words. So you have a completely different worldview that comes out of the Byzantine Empire, out of Constantinople, and floods into Italy. And we're going to talk a little bit about the spiritual cosmology, the way they looked at the world. So, and we're going to see me kind of go back and forth between different topics throughout the night because they are so interrelated. These spiritual cosmologies are cosmologies that you still find in Freemasonry today, and that's why it's relevant to bring them up. So they are going to be heavily steeped in the Western esoteric tradition, mainly, well, not mainly, but most overtly with Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and Freemasonry is the fourth one. But you also have those esoteric sciences such as Kabbalah, Alchemy, and theurgy. Again, theurgy is going to be ceremonial magic. And when we use the word magic here at Universal Co-Masonry, at least on the Masonic seminar, we're not talking about Houdini and all those great, artists of the 19th, or I guess it would be 20th century. We're talking about genuine mystical experiences through dedicated work to the highest. That's the theurgy. That's the magic we're talking about. So please keep that in context. That's what we're referring to. So you have that influx of those Greek manuscripts and philosophers coming into Italy, especially like Florence and Rome. And Rome is in this period of scholasticism. And you'll see that the Renaissance will ultimately bring scholasticism and nominalism down, and it will eventually replace it, because not that it's fully gone, but it was the prominent idea at the time. So when we look at the different spiritual cosmologies, the different worldviews, and I'm going to stop talking after this and open the floor for questions and comments. And I'm going to do broad strokes on the Western esoteric tradition where most of them overlap. But when you look at the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, and you look at the writings of Plato and Pythagoras and Plotinus, they had a very living view of the cosmos. It was something that was very animated. It was anatomism, where they believed the universe was alive and everything was connected. And that was very much flew in the face of scholasticism and nominalism. Scholasticism, which is going to be brought in a lot by Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus and others, where they, again, were trying to reconcile different philosophies into the Christian theology. But the way that they saw it is that you had distinct individuals, God, Jesus Christ, individuals like spiritual entities that governed the universe, and it was done by decree. So it was very authoritarian, where the Greek classical understanding, according to the Western esoteric traditions, was that it was a living and breathing, that everything was connected. It was a living hierarchy that had a divine intelligence that ran all the way through it. So it's not that they were completely separate and opposite, these worldviews, but they were very different, where you would see that in the Western esoteric tradition, the spiritual cosmology would be more about participation. Like, how were you actively a part of these cosmos? And then if you look at scholasticism and nominalism, which I'll define further here in a second, because they are very different from each other in some ways, you're looking at it being, it's your contemplation. It's a concept. It's not something that is active. It's something that is meditative prayer, that is, mental. Not that it's not spiritual, but it has a mental aspect to it. When you look at Plato specifically, Plato talked a lot of ideals, of universal truths, right? The realm of forms. Remember, in Platonic speak, form isn't, this is solid, this is form to us. Plato defined form as ideals, what we would use the word as ideals, something that is perfect and immutable and is confined to its own boundary. So the common example I give is the five-pointed star is the five-pointed star, and there is a universal form that is a five-pointed star. So when I say form in the sense of Platonicism, I'm using it in the term of ideals. So you'll see that it's based on universals, that there are universals in which the heaven and the earth was connected. Scholasticism had universals and believed in universals, but it was, again, not a living, breathing interaction. It was more of an authoritarian decree from the divine down. Nominalists were the ones that threw a monkey wrench into the whole system and said, there are no universals. Nothing is, there's not a template or an archetype that other things come from. Everything is just individual. And at the top, it's just chaos. The reason being, and this again is a broad brush over everything, is that nominalists said, well, if there are universals, then God is limited. So in the terms of Platonic philosophy, like goodness, the act of being good, the good is the highest principle in Platonic philosophy. Ness is the act of. So goodness is the act of being good. That is an ideal. And if that is universal, then even God could not defy it. And so God is, omniscient, omnipresent. You can't omnipotent. He is, or she, they definitely thought he was a he, but he could not be limited. And so the idea of scholasticism being a universal type of approach really flew in their face. And the nominalists said, no, absolutely not. And so when the nominalists came towards the latter half, or towards the end of scholasticism, it severed that living tie between the divine and earth. It cut it out. The universals were the way that we as individuals can connect to the divine to understand it. And Freemasonry in its philosophy falls on the side of universals, whether you believe it's Platonic or if more of a scholastic. No, that's up to each, brother, or Mason. It's not like decreed from our grand, our grand constitution. It doesn't work that way. But when you look at it, universals is like the divine's way of giving us tools to understand divinity, and that divinity within ourselves as well as in nature. And there are other differences between the cosmological viewpoints, enough so that when the Greek philosophers brought these transcripts over, it really rocked the form of scholasticism and nominalism. It was a completely different way of seeing the world. So I want to stop here, and I want to see if there are any questions or comments from the group. and as well as our platforms about what we've been talking about in general. So if you have a question from Zoom, please raise your hand virtually. And if you're coming from the streaming platforms, you can go ahead and put that in. All right, if you guys have no more questions or comments, then we will go forward. Let me share my presentation again. So again, I just want to put us back on task in case you feel like you kind of got like, where are we going? Remember, this is about how did modern day Freemasonry come about, and what is its philosophy like, and that's where we're going. So I would tell you that, at least this is anecdotal, for my own personal experience, I had more of a scholastic worldview when I was growing up, under the tutelage of my parents, which forever grateful for. But I would say that through Masonry, my spiritual worldview, my worldview has been greatly changed to more of a universalistic type of understanding of archetypes and seeing nature through different lenses than more of a divine decree. Now, again, that's not to say that those who are more of a scholastic nature, that you have to believe a certain way. That's not true. There's lots of brothers that see it very differently in Masonry. So keep that in mind. All right, other things that they brought in, these Greek philosophers, was theurgy. Again, theurgy is ceremonial magic. So we're going again into this idea that Masonry is ritual. And oftentimes I've heard the head of our order say, if you the inquires, Masonry is ritual. And I think that's a very important sentence. I don't know if I was told back in the day before I joined with, that it was ritual. I don't know if I know what that meant, but also I was fairly young at the time. But if I were to define it, like if you are someone who looks at dedicating time and energy to a certain way of things, the way that, brushing your teeth is not ritual. So don't argue with me on habits. Like to me, that's the dumbest conversation. There's a difference between ritual and habit. If you want to make your brushing your teeth a sacred experience with the divine, then perhaps it can be a ritual. And for someone, it might be, but that's the exception. So when we look at ritual is doing prescribed set of actions with a dedication to the transcendent, meaning that you are trying to invoke the sacred, the greater than, and hopefully for the betterment of others, which is the difference between the right and the left-hand path, right? So we're doing ritual to promote goodness in whatever form that may take through our work. And that's theurgy. So when it's like this, the sum is greater than the parts. When you do ritual, if you have a bunch of members and a bunch of Masons in a room, everyone's doing their part and they're doing it to the best of their ability. It creates something that is incommunicable. It is ineffable. And that energy, hopefully, and every Mason dedicates it to something different. It's not like we all sit down and say, this is our dedicated intention, like we're all going to focus on world peace or whatever. You can, if you want, to do that for yourself, but everyone is dedicating that energy to something that is greater than themselves. So maybe it is to create peace and harmony in maybe a politically unstable time, or maybe it's about bringing healing and love to something, like it's something that is positive and something that is for the betterment. That's theurgy. And we can spend a whole time, an hour and a half, on the power of theurgy. This is what's being brought back into Europe. It wasn't there. It's not that it wasn't there. It was very anemic. It was very weak. The Catholic Church has lots of ritual, and perhaps the priestcraft I would like to think in the Catholic Church at the time and even now understands the theurgy that they create. But it's difficult when you have kind of a passive interaction with that ritual, when you really, don't necessarily understand it. Not that you can't get something from it, but it's not the same as an active participation. So you'll see that this starts to come back into the scene, and there is a revival of the magical, of the enchantment of the world. And enchantment is really much a huge part of a living universe, something that's not, I'm not talking scientifically living, I'm talking about spiritually alive, that's spiritually animated, that has a conscience, that is, so complex, but so simplistic at the same time. There's a beauty in that. And theurgy tries to tap into that and create a conduit for that energy to go to another place that it's needed. It's very much a gradient. If you're familiar with osmosis, think of it as spiritual osmosis or diffusion, where you have a concentration of a lot of energy in one area and you want to diffuse that energy to an area where it has less. So where there's unrest of any kind, taking that energy and moving it to that space allows you to pull it from a very concentrated form and put it in a place that needs it. Again, that theology is brought into Italy and it's going to breed it into the Italian Renaissance. And this is more of the same with the harmony of the spheres, where you're looking at a worldview where everything makes sense with everything else. Nothing is random. And even though it seems chaotic to us, it's not chaotic to itself. Everything is in perfect harmony. And this is just a complete side comment. There is on YouTube, it took us forever to find it, but you can find the actual music of the cosmos on YouTube if you spend some effort looking, where you can hear what the actual planets sound like and the symphony of our solar system. And I've listened to it numerous times, and it's interesting people's different reactions. I found it cathartic. There's some people that it really agitated them for some reason, because it's not like you're listening to Beethoven or Bach or anything, or Chopin or anything like that. You're listening to like frequencies and harmonies and how they play and with the revolutions around the sun. It's amazing. There's that symphony that you can hear, and the Greeks brought this back into the world. And you have to remember, we're going to see individuals like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo Galilei. Like we're going to see these great big giants of science at the end of this who are going to be impacted with the idea of the harmony of the spheres. So this is a revolutionary way of looking at things back in a time and day where it was much more rigid, much more brought down and less active. When I say brought down, coming from a divine authority, and you just, as I say, divine download, unzip your head and let it just come in, and then that's it, and you do what you're told. And there's nothing to say that there's wrong with that. It's just a different way of perceiving the world compared to what the Greeks did. Another thing they brought in was emanations back from the Western esoteric tradition. Emanation is where you're going to have, and there's different variations depending on whether it's Gnosticism or Platonicism and that type of philosophies. But the generality of emanations is that from the divine emanates all that is until you get into matter, which is the densest, emanation. And so coming from the center out is an emanation. This comes in to the foreground. And then the divine correspondence, as above, so below, which I know I'm kind of a science geek, but I absolutely love this picture I'm showing you here on the right. Because it's true, this isn't like someone's like rendition. If you ever want to know because who wouldn't want to know what the root system of a tree is going to look like? Look at the way it spans its foliage. That's what the roots look like. And it makes sense because if you have like an evergreen or a redwood, where they're really tall, well, the roots would have to be equally as deep to hold up that massive structure. Likewise, my favorite tree, because who doesn't have favorite trees, is the weeping willow. The weeping willow, is very broad. So the root system underneath has to be very broad to support the weight of that tree, else it would fall over. Or it wouldn't even be able to grow that way. So as above, so below. I love this image because of that. It demonstrates that what is above is below. This is a Hermetic axiom. And the whole axiom is as above, so below, as above, as within, as without, and as without, as within. Meaning that everything is connected. The law of correspondence. This is really, really important. And I think as a Freemason, it has brought me a lot of, I want to say comfort, but it's not really the word. It's a lot of placement in the world, in that you're going to see that you belong to this universe, that you have a part and a purpose. This is very humanistic, which we'll get into later. That you have a part and a purpose in this world, and that everything's connected. That as I was talking to a bunch of Masons yesterday, we were studying a particular degree, and I was talking about the officers of the lodge, right? Because there are different positions in lodge, and there's the head of the lodge, which is the master of the lodge, and there's all these other positions. And the point I made was that each position is going to be, held by a Mason, but each Mason represents a unique universe. So as many people are joining us this evening, that's as many universes that are in contact with this conversation right now. Put your mind in that space. That's pretty impressive. Just how complicated and complex and beautiful each of our universes are, but yet that universe is connected to the macro universe. That macro-micro relationship is going to come back into Italy by way of Constantinople to help the people of that time have this revival of understanding that their place is everywhere in the universe, that there is a purpose to what we're doing. All right. So we have Marsilio Ficino, who, again, excuse me, extremely important. Him and Pico, and I'm going to use them kind of interchangeably, even though they're not the same. These people are extremely important because they're the ones, Pico is the one that translated, along with Ficino, they translated different Greek texts and manuscripts into Italian. So remember, they originally were in Greek, then they were co-opted by Rome, so they went into Latin, and then they moved to the Byzantine Empire, which was Arabic. So again, we have there's a lot going on. And you're going to see that from there, they're going to be translated into Italian. And some of it's going to be translated into Latin, back into Latin. So there's going to be an access to these manuscripts where there was a language barrier before. The Corpus Hermeticum is, you can buy it because of Ficino and Pico. You can have access and you can read it. And it's very interesting. And it talks a lot about the Hermetic tradition. And that's why you'll see that this particular section, the Renaissance and the Hermetic tradition, kind of goes together. But you're going to see a blending of very ancient Greek with now, at that time, very modern Europe. And it's going to come in and we're going to see a blending of Christianity because you got to remember the landscape of Europe at that time is very religious. I've mentioned this book before. It's by one of my favorite historians, Frances Yates. She has since passed, but she wrote two really good books. The second one I'm finishing up. I haven't quite finished it yet, but the first one is The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and the second one is Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. And she goes a lot into what this is about and how this just revolutionizes and is a revival of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism. That's why I struggle with the Hermetic tradition, even though that's what this is blatantly called, because there's Neoplatonism in there as well. So you'll see that there's great figures, and the Medici family was huge because they were super wealthy. They would hire people like Ficino and Pico to translate these documents. And then you're going to see that through the Gutenberg press, right, that we all have access to it now, that we're able to read these things for ourselves. Again, a tangential question, but it is very important. The purpose of modern day education, I know there's a lot of controversy about how well, at least in the US, education is today, but the original purpose of education was to be literate in reading, writing, and basic math. So like, core function math. And the Gutenberg press allowed that to be a possibility for all of us here to be able to read and to write. And you'll see that you have Pico Mirandola. He's the one that did the Oration of the Dignity of Man. He was a polymath and amazing at languages, just amazing, amazing. This Oration of the Dignity of Man will lead into his 900 thesis on the things that were wrong with the Catholic Church at the time. So very interesting. He brings that out. The Gutenberg Press is going to bring that out. And then you're going to see Ficino do the Theologia Platonica. And so these are some major, major books that you can pick them, like the Oration of the Dignity of Man, you can get off of Amazon. But they bring this into the common hands of people. People start to become literate. People are starting to understand that they can take their own education in their own hands. They don't necessarily have to rely on the priestcraft. Now, before we get into, and again, that like I just brushed over a huge part of the Renaissance just for the sake of time. So, for those who may be more inclined to this era, you're missing out on a whole bunch of stuff. I know. So, if you're really interested, I would recommend looking into those particular Pico Mirandola and Marsilio Ficino. They're phenomenal in the Renaissance. They're a huge part to play in what we have today and the things that we love, especially in Masonry. So the one thing I want to say about the Gutenberg press and the ability for all of us to read and be able to instruct ourselves is that there seems to be, especially with the era of the Enlightenment, which will follow after the Renaissance, there seems to be kind of a, excuse the vulgarity, but kind of a crapping on priestcraft, like especially in the United States where, we want unfettered freedom or we don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And the priestcraft definitely removes that capability for people to have personal interpretation. So there is a purpose though to the priestcraft. There is a reason why they exist. So I would recommend to definitely look into the relevancy of them because they do hold the keys to theurgy and the way that ritual is done. However, we will see with the rise of humanism why that is so important. And we're going to stop here to see if there's any comments or questions and give my voice to rest a little bit. Is there any comments or questions for anyone about what we're talking about tonight? Let's do a thought experiment. The thought experiment is this. What would the world be like today if the Gutenberg press was never invented, or any type of press was never invented? What would Western civilization look like today? What would Freemasonry look like today? And I want to hear what you guys think. And this is a little bit of a futuristic experience, but I think it's important to understand the impact of that particular invention. What would the world be like today if we did not have the Gutenberg press invention? Brother Christine, you have to unmute her. Hold on, Brother Christine. Okay. Sorry, a little bit of technical difficulty. Brother Benjamin, can you get her unmuted?
I've asked her to unmute, so she has to do it from her.
Okay, Brother Christine, you have to do it from your end now. You've been asked to unmute. Okay.
I was pushing the wrong side. I'm sorry. I have these glasses on. I can only read up close. Thank you so much. This is jam-packed. And I guess my response would be, what was it like before the Gutenberg press? And think about the Dark Ages or the medieval period before the Renaissance. So I think that even though we had the Renaissance, but I wonder if it would have regressed. So that would be my response.
Thank you for that. Brother Otia. Sorry, I lowered her hand on you. Sorry, Otia, we have to find you. I lowered the hand on Brother Benjamin before he could unmute you. Brother Otia, can you raise your hand again since I dropped the... There you are. Thank you. Sorry. You got her?
Okay.
There you go. There you are.
All right. Thank you, Brother Katie. There's a lot of information to take in here. I would say I think the last part of your question was, what would Freemasonry be like? I think that it would just rely on the oral tradition, which I believe in the beginning, that's basically what it was. And a lot of religions, like if you look back to a lot of the African religions, it was just based on oral tradition, just passing the story down. I think a lot of, we look back into biblical times. Who was writing anything down? It was all just storytelling, and you in turn, told it. Those that received communication from, God or Allah, whomever. It was all oral. I think that if we look at it from a standpoint like today, I think we would be quite ignorant because it takes a lot of effort to take in the story, pass on the story, and pass it on, not like a game of telephone, where by the time it gets to the end, it's something completely different. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I don't think our civilization, our society today is built for that. So I think it would be very different, and I think we would be very ignorant. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you, Brother Aurora.
Hi, Brother Katie. So I think the Gutenberg Press really industrialized education. It made obviously books available to the common man. So instead of having to rely on the priest to interpret the Bible or any kind of literature, the common man was able to learn to read and thereby learn to write, which brought about the Industrial Revolution, which brought about the technological revolution. So we'd be definitely in a different place today were it not for the Gutenberg Press. And I think it's already been said, but lots and lots of ignorance. And while the oral tradition may have been alive, the masses would not have the capacity to educate themselves and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Aurora. Brother Hallie.
So to your point on as above, so below, while I think there would be a lot of ignorance, I think humans inherently would also try to find a way to communicate that's differently and express themselves maybe through different kinds of art, and find a communication pattern through that. So even though, only people who maybe are skilled to be able to pass along oral communication or written communication, if they like truly learn how to scribe, would not be great for the masses. I do think that the masses would find a way to express, and pass down their own stories in a very different way than we currently are. That might be in a way that we're not even thinking about, that could, create different schools of thought and different ways of doing things that we don't know because we haven't experienced it.
Excellent point. Thank you. Brother Brennan.
I think that writing has allowed us to exponentially communicate with people far away and have access to new ideas. But at the same time, I think without it, I think that the cultures that did not or do not have writing today seem to have a better understanding of their local environments and their local systems of nature. So I think it's just a different way of knowing. You lose some knowledge and you gain some. It's just a different way of seeing and understanding things.
Thank you for that, Brother Brennan. It's an interesting idea, especially in today's age where it's like the age of disinformation. There's so much information that you can consume that sometimes, maybe a lot of times, depending on where you're at, you're consuming information that's wrong. And so there is, with every invention, there is the good and the bad that comes with it. Fortunately for the Renaissance and those Greek classics that start to be infused throughout Europe, moving through Italy and out into Europe, that it allowed for this penetration of a very, very unique worldview that many people can have. So the Gutenberg Press, it's an interesting thought experiment of like, what would the world be like? And I tend to agree with some of the things that were said about, it'd be definitely very different. But the interesting thing is a commentary here on modernity is how many people use their literacy, mainly in reading and writing, to really propagate the good, the beautiful, and the true. That's a good question. The majority of people, do they or do they not use their literacy well, which we take so for granted because everyone, what was it? I saw a statistic and I don't remember the date. It was in the 1900s. So where it was kind of like a pyramid where you had like 1% of China, and this is specifically to China, was literate, and then by the end of the 1900s, 99% was. So it was like flipped on its head. And you can see statistics around the globe that has that, where people became, the quality of life was tied to the literacy. The interesting thing about the quality of life is that it's not just a material perspective. The spiritual perspective also impacts quality of life. So the ability to pick up the Gospels or the Torah and to read it for yourself, to see what is done and how it is interpreted by those who would interpret it for you, is a very unique and evolved experience. And there is criticism, about there's these especially with the Bible, like there's all these different interpretations and they don't all mean the same thing. And over time, if you read, I have here back in the library a bunch of like who wrote the Bible and what is that word, was it Elohim? Does Elohim mean a single God, or does it mean multiple gods? And what does that mean? And there is a responsibility that the Gutenberg Press put upon all of us that maybe some people are aware of. I don't think a lot of people are, is that we have to be aware of what we consume. And it's not to say, oh, is it true or is it not true? It's try to understand what truth lies inside of it, and from there move off and have a better understanding, because everything you read is true to some extent. You just have to figure out the context in which it's true and how it relates to the entire universe, because everything's connected. Even the most deplorable of philosophies where you're like, dude, that is awful. There is an impact. There's a reason why it was written, because someone had the experience and multiple people had the experience of it. But the idea is to understand that, and not necessarily not to repeat it, but to understand why they made the choices they did and how that impacted modern society. So the Gutenberg Press is a very fascinating invention, because it is so pivotal in all of our lives. Every one of us is affected by the Gutenberg Press. I mean, the fact that there's books that are behind us that anyone here can read, that itself is a testament. All right, so let's move forward. Let's talk about some humanism. So, so in the upper right, you have an image of scholasticism, where you're sitting as a congregation and you're having an authority figure, a priestcraft, telling you what, reading to you or explaining to you the text. And then below you have Leonardo da Vinci, who was one of the great artists of the Renaissance, along with Botticelli and others, Michelangelo and whatnot. And that's going to be more of a humanistic symbolism. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Freemasonry today and modern humanism. So the idea is, with humanism that's coming out of this Renaissance, is two things. Two things are super important that come out of humanism at this time. One is that the very positive nature of man, that the man himself is good. And that is something I personally agree with. I mean, not that it matters if I personally agree with it. You can disagree with me if you want. But the idea that human beings are amazing, and that they are worth saving, and that they are worth fighting for, even if they're making the worst choices in the world. Like, they are still these amazing human beings, that they are the co-author in their salvation, comes out of humanism. Again, I'm talking Renaissance humanism, what it originally was intended. So that's the first thing, is the power of the man. The second thing is free thought. Now, this is where Masonry really, both of them, really you'll find it in Masonic philosophy, but the free thought is so important. So we have, people present different ideas in lodge when we're not doing ceremonies and whatnot. Like ceremonies like, initiations where we're making someone a Mason or so forth. But we do studies and we study a bunch of different stuff, anything under the sun. And we study it in the context of Freemasonry, because that's the language that everyone in the lodge speaks, that we share, right? And when we look at ritual and we look at theology and we're looking at these studies, we believe, especially in Universal Co-Masonry, we have the maximum amount of discipline, meaning that we do ritual the way it's supposed to be done. And we're very particular about that. The head of our order, the purpose in that position is to make sure the ritual is done well and is done right, so that the theology can be maximized. The one thing that we don't do is tell you what to think. You are at liberty to interpret however you want, whatever worldview you hold and whatever scope you see the world through, that is your right. No one's going to tell you, hey, Brother Katie, you're wrong. Hey, Brother Benjamin, you're wrong. No one, it's actually considered very un-Masonic to say you're wrong. You can say, I disagree with you. You know, Brother Patrick, I see it totally different. I don't agree with what you're saying, and here's my reasons. But you would never be told, Brother Katie, you're wrong. Brother Patrick, you're wrong. Brother Benjamin, you're wrong. Because you are at maximum freedom of mind to understand the symbols of the universe the way that you are intended to understand it. The studies are there to help inform, to help give you a better depth and understanding of what it is, whatever it is that you're studying at the time, so that you can make a more informed choice. And that's why oftentimes, like, I'll read things I don't believe in. And we have here at our headquarters, we have a really, it's a smaller library, but it has beautiful first editions of all sorts of different stuff. But it has a section on anti-Masonic literature. So if you want to go read what people who don't like us say about us, we have a whole section, because we're not going to tell you what you can and cannot read. And I would read it because it's interesting to see what those people who don't agree or don't like us have to say. And, you know, there's always a seed of truth that has been made spectacular and taken out of context. And you can see why they went the way they went, and then you understand them. Again, I quote Ender's Game, you know, to know your enemy is to love your enemy. And not that I think these people are my enemy, but you get the point. To know them is to love them. And understanding and the humanistic approach is pivotal. Like Masonry, we were talking at earlier seminar this year, Brother Yane had asked the question about, you know, there's heliocentric, there's geocentric, and he was like, well, you know, I think it's man-centered. Well, that's anthropomorphic centric. That's anthrocentric. That man is at the center of creation. And Masonry holds all three views in complete parallel. There is no conflict. Though some people might think there isn't. They live in complete harmony because the universe is helio, geo, and anthrocentric. It is. It's all of them. And so the humanism of the Renaissance, of the Italian Renaissance specifically, is the humanism that you will find particularly in universal Co-Masonry, that you are allowed to think. Now, that doesn't mean you're not going to be challenged. Lots of times, especially these two here will tell me that they don't agree with me all the time. It's most frustrating. You know, they'll tell me I don't agree, and here's the reasons why. You know, and there's a dialogue and there's discussion. That's why in universal Co-Masonry, it's adogmatic. And I want to clarify that term because oftentimes people think adogmatic is without dogma. No. Universal Co-Masonry has dogma in the sense like you have to believe in the transcendent in whatever capacity that is. You have to believe in the permanence of the soul. You know, those are things that are dogmas, but how you believe that, no one's going to tell you. So if you're coming from a Christian perspective, or if you're coming from an Eastern, you know, philosophy perspective, like Buddhism or, you know, Shintoism or whatever, Sufi or, you know, whatever, you know, particular belief you have, that's up to you. But we have a maximum amount of freedom to think and interpret whatever we want. This is something that is very much in contrast to scholasticism, which is going to be, again, that understanding of I am the priestcraft, I understand how to read this particular religious text, and I'm going to be the one that interprets to you those what it means, because I hold the keys of that authority. And now, again, I don't want to crap on the priestcraft, because they do have their part. They are given the keys to an understanding, but there is that part of humans such as you and me have the right to interpret it and say, yeah, I don't know if I agree with that. Now, the one thing that Masonry should, in my opinion, teach, and I find it does here at Universal Co-Masonry, is that you can't just say, well, I don't agree with it because I don't like the way it makes me feel. I don't like that. That's emotivism. That's moving from emotion. That's making decisions from emotion. You need to understand why you don't agree. So if you're like, well, I don't think that there's the prisca theologia, which is something that came out of the Western esoteric tradition and is brought back into the Renaissance through Ficino. The prisca theologia is that there is a single truth that is transmitted through particular figures. This is different than the prisca theologia, the Philosophia Perennis. They're two different things. The prisca theologia is saying that, through Plato and Hermes Trismegistus and the great figures of that time, there's a uncorrupted truth that heralds back to the beginning of time. That is something that's really, you have to understand why you agree or disagree with that. You have to understand the different contrasts, because in Masonry, we're not married or shouldn't be married to our ideas. Like, these are what defines me, but they are not me. So if someone says, well, Brother Katie, I don't agree with whatever part, it's not a personal wound. It's like, oh, well, tell me why. This is why I love talking about politics and religion. It's not so much to convince someone one way or the other. It's, I want to know why people think the way they think. And I think that curiosity is extremely important, not to convince and win, but again, to understand. That's humanistic. That is where we're looking at understanding the world through our interpretation, understanding from a Hermetic standpoint that it's not always true. Like, most truths are half truths if we're lucky, and that we need to really keep studying. And that's why in Masonry, we are tasked with studying. You should study Masonry, not just like Masonry like is in the ritual, but Masonry is everything. So study everything and try to understand it so you can understand where you have been limited and where you need to better understand. So I've beaten that to a good pulp. Now, when we look at today's, the modern humanism, this one's a little bit different because it's more secular and it's more atheistic. Sometimes I get asked, are atheists allowed in Masonry? Can they be Masons? It depends on the Masonic obedience, whether it's a yes or a no. When you look at universal Co-Masonry, I would say no, because our rituals are based off of the transcendent, the great architect. So if you're like, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in the great architect, I don't believe that there's anything higher than myself, maybe humanity, then I would recommend Continental Masonry, which is more French Masonry, and they tend to do more of a civic reform. So they're more secular, they're more atheistic, they're more about problems of modern times versus spiritual advancement. So secularism and atheism has kind of co-opted humanism, that humans are the highest. Masonry in its philosophy is a more Renaissance understanding of humanism, that it's because the humanists of the time are going to be, they're going to be Hermeticists. They're going to be steeped in the Catholic Church. They're going, or once the Reformation comes around, they're going to have that Protestantism that's a part of their understanding. Even Isaac Newton, who people are like, they cite him all the time as an atheist. He was a devout Anglican and a huge practitioner of alchemical magic and trying to unlock the universe. Like, he was deeply religious. So when you look at humanism, keep an understanding that there are different types of humanistic approaches. And in Universal Co-Masonry, it's very much in tandem with that Renaissance understanding that there is a transcendent, that it is connected, but man is at the center of creation. How that looks, it's going to be a little bit different. Okay, moving on, let's check my time, make sure I'm running out of time. All right, so when we look at Kabbalah starts to come back in. It was also something that was lost. This is going to be your fusion, a little bit of that Jewish mysticism, but it's going to be given more of as a science. So the divine science, and this brought in numbers like gematria. This looks at looking at geometry as a sacred form. Now, remember, Pythagoras very much, and Euclid, and they very much saw geometry as sacred, especially Pythagoras. But there was number inherent in the universe, and there was number inherent in spirit. So one of the studies in Masonry is the 7 liberal arts and sciences, which is the trivium and the quadrivium. And the trivium is there's 6 of them, but there's 3 that's really talked about in the trivium, but they are connected. You have logic, rhetoric, and I always forget the third one. Logic, rhetoric, and come on. Don't leave me hanging.
Grammar.
Sorry. I was gonna say poetry because poetry is a part of grammar, but it's grammar. Thank you. So there's the trivium, and then you have the quadrivium, which is going to be arithmetic geometry, which is why I bring it up. You have music, and you have astronomy. And when I say astronomy, it was also astrology. They were together. It wasn't until the division of church and state that we see astronomy is going to be cleaved from the spiritual side. And you're going to have the hard sciences like Sagan, because we were talking about Sagan earlier. You're going to have the hard scientists and whatnot that are going to be looking at just the cosmos as the celestial bodies. But there was also that spiritual part, which was astrology. And when we talk about, without giving anything away, if you look at number, and this is in regards to the several liberal arts and sciences, specifically the quadrivium, again, that's arithmetic, which is basic math, plus, minus, divide, multiply. Then you have geometry, which is spatial. You have music, which is time. And then you have astronomy, which I'll talk about in a second. If you look at Pythagoras and Plato and the Tetatris, which is from the 1, the 2, the 2, the 3, the 3, the 4. That's the minor. The major Tetatris is going to be 25 total numbers or dots. So if you are a number, if you yourself are a number, the whole purpose of the quadrivium is to understand number, which is arithmetic, number in space, which is geometry. So as number starts to experience space, it's geometry. Then number in time, which is going to be music, and then number experiencing space and time, which is going to be astronomy. That was the purpose of the quadrivium. The entire purpose of the 7 liberal arts and science not only was to teach classical Greek understanding, but it was to prepare the initiate for a higher understanding of philosophy and religion. That was the purpose, is to give them a very strong understanding of, to prepare their mind to receive philosophy and religion, and so theology. That was the purpose of this time. And so with Kabbalah, this was a way of looking at number and looking at geometry and looking at how it really started to come together to create a mystical experience. This also started emerging into Masonic language. I can't say that I'm super strong on Kabbalah, but you can look at the lodge in many different ways. And I've seen brothers play with gematria, which is, number and letters and language, and looking at how it comes together, and, the tetragrammaton and what the number means in Hebrew and how it plays together with your life and being participatory and how that will change the way you behave and stuff like that. So there's a lot. Geometry, not necessarily Kabbalistic geometry, but geometry more of a Pythagorean sense, is going to come in and be a part of, it is the science of Masonry. It's the grand science of Masonry is geometry. And someone once asked me recently if they had to be proficient in geometry. And the answer is no. To be a Mason, you don't have to be proficient in geometry. It wouldn't hurt to know something about it, but you don't have to be proficient. But we start to see in the Renaissance, during this era, when people are just being revived with ancient Greek texts, we also see a Jewish influx of information and mysticism that comes in from Kabbalah. That's something else. All right, so the scientific revolution, again, this is lots of books are dedicated to it, so I'm not going to go through it a lot. But the one thing that comes out of the scientific revolution, and again, the Rosicrucian Enlightenment by Francis Yates is an excellent read on this particular part. The landscape of Europe is very rocky during the Renaissance. You have the Reformation is coming out towards the end of the Renaissance, so you're having a big struggle between Protestants and Catholics. There's the 30 Years' War. There's a lot of tumult. There's just a lot of really awful experiences, which make people not want to talk about what's on their mind and ideas that they have. So the scientific revolution was like this anomaly that was created in this very chaotic and tumultuous landscape. It was this anomaly that existed where you started to see the birth of invisible colleges, where you had people, scientists from, or what would become scientists, coming from different parts of religion and politics and countries that were at war with each other, but coming into a sacred, safe place to talk about their great ideas and, moving from a geocentric to a heliocentric model, looking at how the stars were rearranging. That you have to remember people like Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, and, this was a tough time to bring ideas out, but the Catholic Church, to be fair, was very modern. Like the Big Bang Theory came from a Jesuit, Catholic Jesuit. And I don't think a lot of people know that. Like the Catholic Church was very pro-science, and I still find to be very pro-science in my experience, where but you were still challenging very old doctrine of like, okay, well, it's not geocentric, it's heliocentric, and you have these harmony, like they were influenced by the harmony of the spheres. How can we harmonize that through mathematics? So you're seeing the fusion of Neoplatonism and Hermeticism coming into science and trying to explain the way that the universe works, and bringing that into an understanding that we have, again, we take for granted today because it's so popular and so well known. Scientific revolution created invisible colleges. And I would argue, and I have argued in the past, that a Masonic lodge is very much a remnant of the invisible college, which the Royal Society in England is, eventually what would come out of the invisible college in England is the Royal Society. But Masonic lodges are these anomalous places where you have people that can talk about pretty much whatever they want, in the safety of discussion and understanding. Again, you can say, I totally disagree. I think that's a terrible philosophy or an understanding, but it is done in civility and in the pursuit of further advancement of spiritual attainment. And so the scientific revolution, again, is touched with Hermetic philosophy, and again, Hermetic philosophy also including Neoplatonism as well. And we're seeing that this understanding of nature is being reflected in trying to understand the divinity within man. So I wish, if I could go back in time, I wish I could get 2 different degrees in addition to my love of science. I would love to get a philosophy of science degree, and I'd love to get a historical degree in science. And just looking at how these great giants of change and forethought really were shaped by the time and religions of their day, that they were very hermetic, they were very alchemical. Again, this Isaac Newton when he passed away, his works, I think I went to his niece. You have to double check me, it's been a while since I looked that up. I think his work went to his niece, and he was devoutly Anglican, and so was she, and they suppressed it because the alchemical works were seen to be heretical at the time. But now they're starting to pull him up, not that we can interpret what he wrote because it's all in cipher, but it was people that were just super big in science and changing the course of natural philosophy were also very religious individuals. All right, going fast because I only have like 10 minutes. All right. So the Rosicrucian manifestos. If you ever have a chance to read the trilogy of the Rosicrucian manifestos, do so. They're not that long. You have the Fama, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz. They're each individual. This book, I have it. I've read it. Like they have all 3 of them, and you can get off of Amazon. So what happens when you have the Renaissance, where you see all of this ancient wisdoms coming back in, the prisca theologia is being reintroduced through Ficino. You're seeing all of these great Neoplatonic and Hermetic ideas are just abundant now throughout Europe. They're spreading like conflagration. They're just amazingly rapid fire across the world. The trilogy, what was a powder keg with the Gutenberg press, this was definitely the aftermath, because there was such an amazing response to the Fama, which came out in 1614. That was, again, tacked to the door and was distributed through the Gutenberg press and other minor presses that were around at the time. And what this does was it brought to the forefront the idea of secret society. So again, the invisible colleges weren't considered secret societies, but they were there, but they were nebulous, and they were more in the scientific realm. Here was the spreading of esoteric ideas, and you were seeing that you had secret societies that were dedicated to the great work. The great work comes from the alchemical idea, where it's the magnus opus, where it's that which is the philosopher's stone. And as I was saying yesterday to someone, not to be confused with the elixir of life, because they're 2 different things. The philosopher's stone, and this is regeneration in the spiritual and intellectual way, that we are becoming our truest form, that we are so purified that we are spiritual gold. So you have the Fama, the Confessio, and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, which The Fama and the Confessio, they go really well together. When I was reading the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencrantz, I'm not quite sure why it was added to the trilogy because it's really its own kind of work. It's a very esoteric. You definitely have to sit down with a speculative eye to try to understand, Christian Rosencrantz's call to this wedding, and it goes through this whole discussion of wedding. He almost dies, and it's very interesting, but it's very different than the other two. But what it does is it talks about philosopher initiates, which is extremely important to Masonry. Now, there is this understanding that some people believe in history that Freemasonry came from the Rosicrucians. They did not come from the Rosicrucians. They ran parallel to each other. It's more likely that they would come, and I'm not saying they are, that they came out of the invisible colleges than Rosicrucianism, even though we have various degrees that are very much like Christian Rosencrantz and the Rose and the Cross and whatnot. If you believe Christian Rosencrantz was even real, a lot of people take him as a mythic figure. What this did, this Rosicrucian manifestos, they laid the groundwork for secret brotherhoods to survive. So what Freemasonry owes us in gratitude to the Rosicrucians is the ability to exist as a secret society, because the Rosicrucians made it very acceptable and popular, and people waited and wanted this to be real. And the things that were being put out on the manifesto. So through the invisible colleges, you're going to see that Masonry, modern day, is going to have this influence from that Italian Renaissance, humanism. It's going to have all those Western esoteric ideas coming into its philosophy and creating a better understanding of a perennial philosophy. And then it's going to, because of Theodosius I, it's going to move into the Gilding Age. So a lot of people are like, oh, Masonry's from the guilds. It has some play in the guilds. It's not from the guilds. It's going to have an influence of the guilds. But as the cathedrals, unfortunately, started, stopped being built, Masonry, operative Masonry, started to become speculative. And the Rosicrucians and this manifesto created it so that these secret societies could exist. So as more very learned men, because, it's back in the day where the people that benefited from a liberal arts education from the Renaissance would be young boys of nobility. These men were allowed in the guilds as it started to transfer over from operative to speculative. And then through the Rosicrucian manifestos, it was able to create a secret society and really exist in its own turn as its own entity. So I would recommend the Rosicrucian manifestos, but it's not necessarily like a must read for Masonry. I enjoyed them. I thought they were very important. I thought there was a lot of good points out of it, especially because of its blend of all of the Western esoteric sciences as well as mysticism. But it does give you a better understanding a little bit about Masonry. Because the question is like, why is it that Masonry came out of this Western esoteric bed of, ancient Greek and Hellenistic times and moved through the guilds, and then came into what it is today? And what you see here on the right is the Wells Cathedral, which I'm a big fan of Gothic architecture. I think this is absolutely amazing. That man how can you tell me that man's not at the center of creation? Like, look at the ability for us to bring the divine into the things that we build. I don't know if you would take modern day United States architecture as a testament to that, but definitely European Gothic and other architectures in Europe from that time. But what you see is that you have a movement of operative into speculative. So Masonry in its philosophy has a lot of different avenues of which it's been impacted and shaped and molded, and it has the prototype of Masonry, 1717. There's one date I've heard, 1723, with Anderson's Constitutions is another date. But you have this blending of the guilds. Masonry, we wear aprons. I don't think that's a secret. We wear aprons because we're workers, we're laborers of light, we're working for something better. Now, what that is dependent on what branch of Masonry you belong to, depends on what you understand the philosophy to do, but ultimately, hopefully, it's for the good of humanity. And so you have the operative guilds, which, by the way, if you look at a lot of the not a lot of the manuscripts, but there's one manuscript in particular that shows that women were Masons back then. And we also know in Pythagoras's time and whatnot, there were women in his school. So this whole idea of women being not allowed is something fairly new in secret societies and in the guilds. So keep that in mind. But you're seeing that you have the guilds, you have the Western esoteric tradition from the ancient Greece, you have the Renaissance, humanism, and you have all of the great ideas that are coming out of that. You have the foray of that crazy time between the Reformation of the Protestants and the Catholic Church at war with each other. And all of this is going to create what Masonry we have today. And that is why we're talking about it, because if any of this speaks to you, then Masonry may be the place for you. It may be the place where you learn your spiritual evolution and your destiny. Because one thing that Masonry does believe is purpose, that everything has purpose, but we have to work for it. And that we have to have, in order to have good work, we have to know, one, why we're working, and two, how to work. So you have a trowel and a level here, and it's like, well, how do I use a trowel? How do I use a level, and and what does that mean moralistically? So that, I would love for my personal temple to look like the Wells Cathedral. That would be pretty epic if I could build moralistically and virtuously like this. That would be phenomenal. So I'm going to leave you tonight with two things. First off, a thought experiment, because I'm always a big fan of those. And the second one, I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about next month, possibly, unless I change my mind. So what I'd like you to think about is all the different parts that you've heard about, the different philosophies, whether it's Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, whether it's humanism, whatever. What does your personal cathedral look like? If you were to be a cathedral, if someone were to throw you up on the screen like I've done as a cathedral, what would you look like? What would and it doesn't have to be a cathedral, I just picked it because of the guilds, but what type of architecture do you think you look like right now? And be in the present right now. What do you look like? And then I want you to do the second part of the thought experiment, which is, what are you supposed to look like? Is there a reconciliation that needs to happen, and how are you going to get there? And I think, I don't know, I can't speak for everyone, but I know what I think I should be, and I'm trying to get there. I'm not there yet, but I'm constantly trying to make sure I understand and have that freedom of thought and understanding, and that intellectual and spiritual humility to recognize when I'm wrong, to help create an edifice that is worthy of the temple of humanity. Because I think the temple of humanity is made up of all small temples of every single human being that has been, that is, and that will be. So what type of architecture do you represent? And if it is not the architecture you're supposed to be, what can you do to become that? That is the life of a Mason. We're trying to figure out where we're supposed to be and how that architecture can assist humanity. So that being said, next month, I think we're going to talk about dogma, because who doesn't love talking about dogma? I'm going to throw some landmarks in there. Especially specific universal landmarks especially landmarks of universal Co-Masonry. That's the sentence I wanted to say. I'm going to look at that, I think, and look at dogma. There's such a negative, especially in North America, specifically the United States, there's such a negative perspective of dogma, and in a lot of ways for good reason. But I do think there is a purpose to dogma, and we'll look at dogma, and we'll look at Masonry, and we'll look at specific parts of the philosophy of Masonry. And I hope that tonight you were able to find something that piqued your interest, maybe clarified a point, or maybe gave you some really good questions to ask, not only yourself, but maybe someone else, as you are on this pursuit of being what you're supposed to be. I truly, truly believe, and Masonry has further instilled in me this thought that everyone has a purpose in this world, in this existence, and we need to actualize it. And so hopefully you have some information tonight that has helped you along your journey. And I hope that you will join us in November on that second Monday. And if you're in the Philippines on that second Tuesday, that you will be a part of our discussion at that time. Have a wonderful night. I want to thank again Brother Patrick and Brother Benjamin for their time here, and we will see you in 1 month's time.